We are milling and void filling the solid wood white cedar top for these custom nightstands. I'm using my jointer and the flattest of the two sides to give myself a square edge to start with. Next, with the squared edge against the fence, I'm going to run it through my table saw, rotate it around, and run the other long edge through the table saw, and take a little off and make another pass just to be sure that everything is true and square. Now, using one of the long sides that's been milled as a reference against my miter gauge, I will cut my first 90-degree side. After that, I will check, make sure everything looks good. Then I will use that first cut 90 against the table fence and cut my other side. Once I do this, I will check all four sides, make sure everything is true and at 90 degrees, and then I'll be ready to move on to filling the voids with epoxy. To prep the wood to fill the voids, I'll first use tape and tape the back sides where any of the deep voids may actually allow the epoxy to drip through. Here's an example of some of the voids I'm going to fill. For these voids, I'm going to use the West Systems epoxy resin with the special clear hardener. And once I add those into my dish, I'm going to stir it for about 60 seconds or so. After that, I'm going to add my black pigment and a little bit of microfill to make the bond stronger in holding these voids together for a permanent bond. I'm going to mix it a little bit more, and then it'll be ready to apply to my workpiece. When filling small voids, I like to use a syringe. That gives me the most control over the flow and the accuracy of the epoxy fill. I like to start at one end of the void and slowly fill in a smooth motion to the other to help reduce the chances of getting bubbles inside the epoxy when filling. This will slowly let the air push out the sides as I'm filling it with epoxy, and I'll make a couple of passes a little bit at a time until I get all the way up a little bit above the top. That way, once I mill it down, it will be nice and flush with the wood. Once the voids have been filled, I'll go back through with the heat gun and just run it over the epoxy briefly to pop any potential air bubbles and help bring them to the surface and get them out of the epoxy. Once that's done, it's time to let the epoxy cure. Here's a look at both tops with the epoxy poured. Once it's cured, it'd be time to mill the tops and give it that fresh, clean look and remove the excess epoxy. The epoxy is cured, and now it's time to mill the top. Now, I don't have a planer large enough to fit this size of lumber through it. I do have a planer, but it won't fit this. And I know some people don't even have a planer, so what I've done is I've built a router jig to plane larger pieces of lumber. I have a separate video on how I built this jig and how it works, so if you guys are interested in that, I'll put a link in the description. But here's a brief overview of how it works, and here's what I did to truly mill flat the top of these nightstands and to reduce and remove the excess epoxy, giving me a nice, clean, finished look that has the voids filled. I set my depth to take a little off the top, and I go back and forth making passes all the way across the workpiece. Then I will check and I will reduce the depth a little bit more and repeat the process going all the way down the workpiece. And I'll keep repeating this until I get to the final finish depth of where I want it to be, which you can see from this view will be until I get everything truly flat and straight and equal amounts of wood being removed from one end to the other and no longer having any additional epoxy leftover residue besides what's actually filling voids, so it doesn't have a messy look. Between each pass going from end to end, I've cleaned off the workpiece, and now that I've made my final pass, I'll show you what it looks like as we sweep off and clean up the workpiece, and this is what you're left with, and it's now ready to move on to the next step of this project. I'll do a quick check and I'll use my level and make sure everything is true and flush and square on top. As you can see, it looks pretty good. I'm happy with this and I'm ready to move on. Next, I just need to remove the tool marks from the router sled and give it that final finished look. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand it, starting with 80 grit and working my way up to 220. And I'll just make nice equal passes all the way through the workpiece. If you want to, you could always use the pencil trick and mark some pencil all the way across everywhere so you know you're sanding evenly, but I've been doing this for a while, so I'm just going to follow a specific pattern and make sure I do it all evenly. And once that's done, I'll wipe it clean, give it a final dust off, and the top should be good. And that's a wrap for this video on milling and filling voids with epoxy on these Custom Cedar Nightstand Tops. Next video, I'll show you how I attach these tops to the nightstands. As always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.